Welcome to the Story Maps Screenwriting Podcast. My name is Dan Calvisi of act4screenplays.com, and we have a special episode this time. We're going to be talking about superhero movies with my friend and writing site member, Steve Lam, who's a superhero expert into all things comic books, and he is a writer for bamsmackpow.com. How's it going, Steve?
Going great, Dan. Happy to be here to talk about two of my favorite things in the world, superheroes and movies.
Yeah. We both have we're both screenwriters, and we have that kind of background, and so we know a lot about movie structure and screenplay structure, so we're going to bring that to our discussion, and it's really exciting that this is also going to be embedded on bamsmackpow.com. But I was really excited by the DC New 52 reboot a couple years ago. And I think what's interesting there is that they are now doing their own cinematic universe similar to Marvel. Now, do you think that's because of the success of the Marvel films?
I think it's totally because of the success of the Marvel films, and I think a lot of what they're doing right now, if you notice that the sequel contains a lot of characters, is that they're now playing catch-up to what Marvel has built since 2008.
There's 4 different movie studios that own the rights to different characters. So you have Fox, which owns the X-Men movie rights, and they also own Fantastic Four. Sony owns the Spider-Man universe movie rights, and so they not only have 2 more sequels to Spider-Man planned, but they have a Venom film and a Sinister Six film in development. And then Warner Brothers, of course, owns Batman and Superman, and the difference now is they're developing a Justice League film. So I know they've casted Wonder Woman, they've casted Cyborg, they have Ben Affleck as the new Batman. Do you know if they've casted any other characters in the Justice League?
Yeah, well, not in the Justice League specifically, but maybe in their universe. They did cast villains, which is Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor.
Oh, right, yeah, okay. Isn't there one more villain that they have?
I think I'm not sure about that. I think Lex Luthor is the main baddie. A lot of people have been speculating that they would like to see Brainiac and other people that's able to challenge Superman intellectually and also physically. So Brainiac would be a great addition if they did do that. But for now, they're sort of setting up Lex Luthor to be sort of like a Mark Zuckerberg type, entrepreneur to bring it up into the modern age.
Yeah, I was just wondering, how will Jesse Eisenberg look bald? At some point, I want him to be bald. So
I'm sure if you go on search bald Jesse Eisenberg or Eisenberg Luthor, many people have already jumped the gun and photoshopped him with a bald cap and everything. So plenty of pictures out there for that.
That also brings up an interesting question, which is kind of this youthification of these reboots, and we're seeing that especially on the TV side. So speaking of Warner Brothers, they already have the show Arrow, and then they are going to be doing Gotham, which is actually going to be on Fox, which is interesting because the Fox network, which is owned by Fox, which owns the X-Men rights, but not the Batman rights. But Warner Brothers is licensing the Batman rights to them for Gotham. But if you've noticed in the trailers, which I know you did a trailer breakdown on Bam Smack Pow, all the characters are younger. So what do you think about that, and what have the fanboys said about that? I mean, they're starting that chronology where Bruce Wayne is a kid and his parents have just been murdered. So, I mean, isn't that like 10 years before he becomes the Batman?
It could be 10 or even 12 years, and it's interesting you asked about how the fanboys think. I think a lot of Batman's prequel, let's just say that, is very much open to interpretation. A lot of people know that, even in comic books, they've been interpreted multiple times in old issues like Legends of the Dark Knight and in Batman Year One, his origins, and they keep adding to the myth. And I think this youthification that you talked about started with, I would say, Smallville, which is one of the most iconic of superheroes. He's actually the granddaddy of all superheroes, and it was actually kind of accepted by the fanboy community to sort of flesh out, what actually, makes Superman. And I think people will be accepting to see how how Gotham does. And you can see from the trailer, Gotham is much darker and grittier and sort of you could say it was inspired very much sort of like the Nolanverse type Batman. So I think it's gonna have a good response.
Hmm. Yeah, but all the villains are also younger, right? They look like they're in their teens or early 20s because they're setting up. I don't know if they have a Joker in there, but they're setting up who's in there, like Dr. Crane, or who are the different villains in Gotham?
Well, so far in the trailer, they've revealed Edward Nygma, who's the future Riddler, Selena Kyle, who's still probably the same age as Bruce Wayne. She's probably like 12 or 13 years old, pretty much a preteen, the future Catwoman, and also Oswald Cobblepot, who's the Penguin. Interesting thing you bring up about the Joker is that what I covered in my video, my my blog and my review of the trailer is that the Joker's history and origins, even the comic books, have been in debate for a while, and that's also because it adds to his persona and the mystery of his bio, and which was more defined in also Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight movie, where they don't know where he comes from.
Hmm.
He lies about his past. There are multiple candidates that could have been him, and he just sort of explodes onto the scene. And one of the origins that they do sort of people agree on is that he used to be the Red Hood, but there's many incarnations of him. As you can see, the famous ones are Jack Nicholson, and of course the one that got Heath Ledger the Oscar win of his portrayal in The Dark Knight.
Hmm. Yeah, I and one of my favorite comic books of all time is Batman: The Killing Joke, which I know they posited a whole origin for the Joker in that one, which I don't. That's the thing about the comic books. Nothing is really accepted as canon anymore, right? Because there's been so many different interpretations of pretty much every character's origin. Do you say that's correct, or are there still just hardline? I mean, is it just up to the fan whether they're a hardliner and say like, no, this is the origin of this character, don't play with it?
I think the fan does sort of have a say in it in their opinion, but you're very much right about things are very suspect what's canon or not. And it's funny you bring up the New 52. The New 52 for a long time. I mean, they do mention the comic books now, but they had debated on whether the death of Superman was even canon after the New 52 launched.
Hmm.
And people said, well, the death of Superman is just too iconic to not be canon. And one of the issues in the New 52 does mention how Superman was killed by this Doom creature, and they don't really explicitly name him as Doomsday, but we all get the hint that it was Doomsday, and it's between 3 years ago that they talk about. So the timelines have been changed back and forth. There's also Crisis on Infinite Earths to happen around the mid 80s,
Hmm.
where they try to reboot it again because Superman, these heroes, and the powers just got too crazy and wild, and they had to say, let's bring it back down to earth and let's get some consistency in these stories. So
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, comic books are rebooting back and forth and reinterpreting their heroes, for just trying to get new fans. I mean, our times change, and comic books are a great commentary about our current events.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something great that Christopher Nolan and David Goyer did with the Dark Knight films, which, by the way, in the Story Maps podcast, me and William Robert Rich of screenplayhowto.com, we discuss the six biggest Christopher Nolan movies. So we talk about the whole Dark Knight trilogy if you wanna listen to that. Um, but yeah, I think this is an interesting issue that now, just like in the comic books, the films are open to new interpretations as well. Like an example of that, I think, would be the film The Incredible Hulk. The Hulk had a totally different design. Like he had, tons of veins all over his body. He looked different, and he was played by a different actor, Ed Norton, than in the Avengers. We now have a new actor playing him, Mark Ruffalo, and the actual character design itself um, is a little bit different. So the fans of the movies are accepting changes in the characters, how they're portrayed, how they're written, how they look, just like in the comic books. So they're kind of feeding off one another, I think.
I don't think the Hulk or Bruce Banner has had an iconic character such as someone like Christopher Reeve who really embodied the character. Now, one of the debates would be when Robert Downey Jr. does leave the Marvel Universe playing Tony Stark, how would fans receive a new Tony Stark, a new actor playing him? He's basically made the role his own, just like how Christopher Reeve had made Superman his own. So I think it depends on the situation.
Yeah, yeah, he really is the anchor. I mean, he casting that moment when they cast Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man was a huge moment, I think, in the creation of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and pretty much superhero movies in general, because what they did was is they took a quality actor who had never been in action movies before, and they took a chance on this guy whose career was not doing so well. And I mean, the guy was he was more in the headlines as being a drug addict than he was as being a great actor. And they really took a chance on him, and they said, we're going to treat these movies super serious. We're going to give you a serious actor and a serious portrayal, and everything's going to be played with a straight face. And that really started off, kicked off the whole movement, you know, and the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe. Which perhaps was that controversial at all? Do you think that they chose Iron Man as the flagship superhero? Because in the Marvel universe, he was never like the biggest superhero, you know.
He wasn't within the Marvel Universe, but if you're going to make an Avengers movie, then Iron Man is certainly the headliner within that group of people. So, I mean, they could have gone either way. They could have started it with Nick Fury, with his story of how he became, the director of Shield, or they could have started with Captain America, any of these characters. But I think Iron Man is pretty iconic to the Avengers, so I don't think a lot of people were up in arms when they chose him. And at the same time, people really didn't even know that Marvel would have this shared universe, this explosion of their cinematic universe at that time. Even people themselves, even Kevin Feige, who's the producer and the brainchild behind all these, I mean the creator behind all of these things, he didn't even know it was going to go this far. And I mean, this experience that they're experiencing, this success that they're experiencing right now is just, they're actually speechless currently.
Yeah. Now, okay, so we were going to talk about all of the films so far in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So if we were to start at, and we can't talk about them all, but just to kind of talk about, the overarching storyline here. Iron Man in 2008 kicked it off. Now there is a credits tease at the end of the credits there. My question would be, at that point in time, did Kevin Feige and the whole team there know that they were going to do this many films and build up to the Avengers, or did they just know, like, okay, the next film will be The Incredible Hulk?
They sort of they already had. I mean, you got to notice Incredible Hulk and Iron Man were already they were almost released back to back. They're in the same year, maybe just a few months off each other. So that had to have been in the works already. But I think how the amount of characters they were bringing in, the speed that they were doing it was, I don't think it was planned that far ahead. I think they fast tracked some of these things. It was probably on a roadmap that was kind of maybe a little bit fuzzy, and maybe they said, we got to do this. And I can certainly say that it was probably fuzzy enough that it wasn't even a hard rumor that people even knew that Nick Fury was even going to show up at the end of Iron Man, the first one.
Yeah, the credits tease of Iron Man was Nick Fury mentioning the Avengers Initiative.
Correct. Yeah.
So I think they knew that that's what they wanted to do, but if Iron Man wasn't a huge hit, it would have been tough to get the financing, probably,
Right.
from the financiers to say, oh yeah, we're going to do 8 movies,
Right.
But that's really, to get back to what we were originally talking about, this is what has had the ramifications across superhero movies with all of the studios. And so now Disney, a few years ago, bought Marvel Entertainment, so they got the movie rights to the Avengers and all the Avengers characters, and they now have a TV show, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. on ABC, and they're developing a series of shows for Netflix. And what it looks like they're doing on TV on Netflix is they're doing the same thing that they did with the Avengers building up to an Avengers film, and they're building up to a Defenders film, it looks like to me. Because they're doing a Daredevil show, and they're doing a couple other, what is it, Jessica, what's that character's name?
I'm not sure about that, but I know that I think they're doing a Luke
Strong.
Cage one.
Yeah, Luke Cage. But I think what they're gonna do, and they're planning to eventually do a Defenders show. So I think basically they're staking their claim on TV as saying TV will be the Defenders and movies are the Avengers.
Correct, correct.
So
And
that's pretty exciting.
yeah, and I have the roster right here. It's Luke Cage, Iron Fist, Daredevil, and Jessica Jones.
Okay, Jessica Jones,
Yep.
that's it. Yeah. And I'm not really familiar with that character, but it's cool to see them focus on a female character as well. You know,
Yep.
it's about time we got some female superheroes going. I know that they have a Black Widow film in development. I don't know if Scarlett Johansson's like completely signed for that, probably because they sign all those actors to like 800 movie
Right.
contracts, I guess. It'll be interesting to see if the Netflix TV series shows will cross over into the cinematic universe too. So
True.
we'll just have to wait and see on that. Also, if we have these 4 Netflix series going forward, there's the question of when do they get released? Because Netflix releases its original series, they'll release the entire season at once. So then, if they're going to eventually all join up as the Defenders, at what point do they become the Defenders? So that's
Right.
going to be really interesting. But to go back to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and then the thing that changed superhero movies forever is that when they did the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they created unity between separate franchises and creating one overall franchise. So by that I mean each film established a new world and the origin of a new central hero. So let's say like Iron Man. So the first Iron Man, 2008, we get the origin of Tony Stark and Iron Man. So you establish that character, but it also expands the overall universe mainly by ending on a push into the next film. But what was unique was that push into the next film was not a push into Iron Man 2, it was a push into the Incredible Hulk, so a separate franchise. So the concept is that there's an entire slate with multiple franchises, but each film has to be structured as a standalone film. And as we know, um, classic screenplay structure is pretty established. It doesn't establish the choices that you make, but it does establish uh, the major beats and the kind of the framework of the story. Um, and that's different than the demands of a comic book. So, for example, when you have screenplay structure in one film, you want to have 4 acts. Okay, it's actually 3 acts, but we separate Act 2 into 2 parts, 2A and 2B. They're separated by a midpoint beat dead center in the story. So we have 4 distinct story engines, one for each act. Act 1, Act 2A, Act 2B, and Act 3. And what a story engine is it's a separate line of action for one major section of the story. Okay, so for example, the Avengers, Act 1 has to do with Loki stealing the Tesseract. Act 2 is assembling the various Avengers to try to catch Loki. They catch Loki, they imprison him on the SHIELD helicarrier. Act 2B is to save the SHIELD helicarrier once Loki's army attacks. And then Act 3 is, of course, the Battle of New York, which is a huge action set piece. And in these superhero movies, you always want to have an escalating threat, and you want to have bigger and bigger action set pieces, which are just, huge sequences, and inevitably you have a lot of CGI and a lot of action going on. Usually in these films there's 3 big action set pieces, and then there might be 2 or 3 smaller ones. You want to have character arcs, which is a character goes through a strong change from beginning to end. You definitely want to have a character arc for your protagonist, and then you want to have one ideally for one, two, or three other supporting characters, depending on how many are in the film. An example of that would be the recent Captain America, the Winter Soldier. Captain America has his arc, and that culminates in him deciding not to kill Bucky Barnes. And the Black Widow has her arc, which culminates in her uploading all of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s intel to the internet, which includes her background, which we know that she has this past that's haunted her. You know, it's suggested that she's basically acted as a hooker to accomplish her missions. So she's showing herself, her true self, and her shame to the world. So that completes her. Like I always say, structure is form, not formula. There is a basic shape to these movies that audiences all over the world react to and like, and I like to say that about 95% of commercial movies, whether they're action, drama, comedy, whatever, they do all use this four-act structure, but it's a form, it's not a formula. A formula would determine what choices the writer would make.
I mean, since we're on the subject of character arcs and everything, can you point out maybe in the cinematic universe, and also maybe it is the Avengers, but can you share with me any superhero movies that you felt had the greatest character arcs, that basically it's when you look at it you go, wow, it's like that guy really changed.
Well, Iron Man always has really strong arcs. Iron Man's arc, Tony Stark's arc, is usually to not be selfish and either to learn to work on a team, you know, as he did with the Avengers, or to be more supportive and loving to the people in his life, like Pepper Potts. So he always has a really strong arc. Um, I'm actually a fan of Iron Man 2. I know a lot of people didn't like it, but I really like it. And he has the element of the arc reactor in his chest is breaking down and it's killing him. And so I thought that was a really good visual, active way to show kind of the decay of his arc, and he has to step up and really become a new man, you know, literally by forging a new arc reactor and healing himself, and then figuratively by becoming less selfish and being a better, you know, partner to Pepper, and just, you know, being a more stand-up guy. So I always think he has some really cool arcs. And then to step over to the Dark Knight franchise, in the Nolanverse, he always gave Bruce Wayne really strong arcs. In the Dark Knight, he basically makes the choice to reveal himself and to, you know, give up his secret identity at the midpoint. But Harvey Dent beats him to the punch and steps in and says he's the Batman. And then in the end, Bruce Wayne decides that he's going to take the fall and he's going to return to being a vigilante and hated, so that they can maintain this myth that Harvey Dent really was the savior of Gotham City. Like he said, he was the best of us. So I thought that was a really cool arc. Did you have anything in mind, Steve?
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, actually, since we're talking about, we were talking about a lot about protagonist arcs. Now, of course, we all know character arcs are driven by, external force pressing against them or pushing against them, and they're forced to change. And of course, this external force is always the villain. So maybe you can talk about, when we're creating a superhero movie, how do you create a memorable villain? Like, what do you think the writers go through to create that characterization? And in recent memory, the greatest villain, I think, in our modern movies that we've had is basically the Joker, played by Heath Ledger. Maybe we can talk about character, or creating these characters that are just as big or bigger than the hero.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting topic. When you're writing a superhero movie, there are certain characteristics that you do want to define. The audience is going to expect you to define. One of them is the villain. You have to have a strong villain, and there's certain types. The Joker, I think, would be what I would call the terrorist type of villain. You know, um, he's a mystery man who steps out of the shadows and just starts screwing things up and causing chaos, and is a killer, isn't above killing innocents, and he's really just completely throwing a city into chaos. And in that sense, The Dark Knight was also a great commentary at the time on the post 9/11 world, especially in the U.S. So it not only was relevant thematically, but it introduced a villain that was kind of scarier than if he was just a guy obsessed with killing Batman. Another type of villain would be the shadow, the opposite of the hero, and that makes me think of one of my favorite superhero movies, which people often forget about, which is Unbreakable, the M. Night Shyamalan film. You have uh, Samuel L. Jackson saying, you know how they know who the villain is? He's the opposite of the hero. And he says, they called me Mr. Glass. I love that line and that ending. Another obvious shadow is Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier, is Captain America's shadow. They have the same background, really, and internally and externally. Externally, because they both took the super soldier serum. So he's also a shadow. Another type of villain would be what I would call the brother. Um, Zod would definitely be like a brother to Kal-El in Man of Steel. They're both they're both from Krypton. They both have the same origin, the same training, I guess, but they're evenly matched, physically. And then I don't know if you would call Bane Batman's shadow or his brother in, as far as category of villain in The Dark Knight Rises, but there's definitely a duality there. Another element, if you're writing a superhero movie, would be the setting. So, for example, in the Nolanverse, they decided to set it in, quote, the real world. They wanted, there's no magic, um, there's no real supernatural content in the Nolanverse, so it's meant to be our contemporary real world, and that was something that was a distinct decision from the beginning. Now, Man of Steel, you obviously have the sci-fi element that he's an alien visitor. Another film that's kind of a hybrid, I would say, would be Blade, because it's meant to be in our real world, but you also have vampires, so you have this crossover with the supernatural world.
I would say the Marvel Cinematic Universe is very much science fiction adventure. Reason I say this is because, like you pointed out, is that there are consequences. And of course, the way the heroes react to these consequences very much make it realistic. And I would say it would be 60% science fiction, almost like 40% realistic. Even the magic that they bring in, I believe, and I might be wrong on this, is that with the Scarlet Witch coming in, supposedly they explain it like supposedly it's magic, but they explain her powers as control over probability. So whatever that means, they sort of give it more of a scientific, mathematical slant to that, to ground it more in logic.
Okay. And they mentioned Stephen Strange in Winter Soldier, but we don't quite know how they're going to handle Doctor Strange, correct? Or have there been rumblings
Correct.
about how they might do that?
That's very much correct. Yeah, we don't even know. I mean, we do know the guy used to be like a top-notch neuroscientist, doctor, and everything like that. So I don't know how they're going to handle magic in the Avengers. They might just segue and just explosively say, boom, we live in a world of magic now, or they'll do a slant where sort of like Thor, they have him come from another planet. He's actually an alien.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how they approached the idea that Thor is a god in the comic books, and I think in our Christian right America, they couldn't say that, and they even have that line in the Avengers. The Black Widow says they're basically gods, and then Captain America has that awesome line. He says, "There's only one God, ma'am," and I'm pretty sure he doesn't dress like that,
Yep.
which I'm sure went over great in the evangelical theaters.
Yep.
And I'm fine with that. They basically gave a science fiction explanation for the Norse gods
Right.
and Asgard. But that's the kind of thing that the screenwriter initially has to address.
Right.
How are you going to approach these dramatic elements?
Right.
And the important thing with the Marvel Cinematic Universe or Fox's X-Men universe is that they are staking their own ground, and we need to take them for the films only. We need to accept that world or that universe that they create on film as its own contained world. Now, of course, we're going to compare it to the comic books, but you would go nuts if all you did was compare every little thing and you researched the origin of every single element of every single character in these universes. Although I guess that's why uh, websites like Bam Smack Pow exist, because then people can do that. But it's tough on the fanboys to watch these films. It can be tough because you're trusting these characters that you love and this universe that you love into the hands of these creative talents. But you're kind of doing that with comic books too. So as we were talking about offline, they've created the same type of atmosphere, if you will, in movies now as they did in comic books, because you have crossovers, and you have the mixing and matching of elements, and you have different creators, and you have reboots. So if we all, maybe you did or didn't accept, um, what's his face, Michael Keaton as Batman, and then you did or didn't accept Val Kilmer, and did or didn't accept George Clooney, but then years later you had to accept Christian Bale as Bruce Wayne. Now you're going to have to accept Ben Affleck as that character. But is that really any different than bringing in a new writer and artist on the Batman comic book?
A lot of people have been arguing about, superhero movies, fanboys saying like, should we just allow the creators to be the screenwriters that write these stories? Because what happens is that the screenwriters who are specifically trained in the screenwriting genre and not in, maybe don't have a history in comic books, they pick and choose what they want in the comic books. And sometimes it bastardizes a lot of the fiction and the origins of superheroes, and that's what angers a lot of the fanboys, because they know that's what makes that character special. Now, this could be also a reason why the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been so successful, is that there's less of this bastardizing, there's less of this, I take what I want. And it's probably because Kevin Feige, the producer, the reason he was hired on to lead this whole, I guess, this plan, this master plan, this architecture of, this whole universe, is that he himself has an encyclopedic knowledge of all of Marvel's characters and storylines. So he's the one. He's basically you could say, the Thanos of the world. He's the mastermind. He's basically controlling all how the pieces meet, and he has things planned, I believe, through 2026. And they have a whole staff of people that actually have to coordinate whenever a character does something or a storyline goes somewhere, is how does this affect not only the TV universe, but the movie universe, everything.
Yeah, I mean that's just crazy that they would have it planned that far ahead. Now, what about it? Does it also affect the comic books? Is it working in reverse?
The comic books are actually its own separate thing right now. So there's a delineation. There's the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which functions like a comic book, and then there's the comic book universe. Because you remember, the comic books also has, like I said, the universe took some of the elements that might have worked well, and they blended it pretty well, and that's also probably because of Feige. Is that you got the ultimate Nick Fury mixed in with the classic storylines of the regular Marvel characters, and in the comic books, I mean, you have the ultimate version of Nick Fury, and the ultimate version of Spider-Man. There's also ultimate Iron Man, which are completely separate. They have separate bios, separate histories. They're reinterpretations of the original characters. So both are both are in separate worlds right now. They haven't crossed over yet, but who knows? I mean, they've been doing so much crossing over. I wouldn't be surprised if one day they just decided to do that also.
What about themes? I mean, I think there is crossover in themes. I made a list of some major themes that are often explored in movies. I mean, in a screenplay, in a film, the theme is essentially why you're telling this story. It's what is the idea, the emotion, the human truth that is being expressed. So, for example, the theme of justice, responsibility, family. These are common themes. Family and discrimination are seen often in the X-Men movies. You know, I think the X-Men movies, and I guess comic books as well, although they're different, operate best when mutants are a an allegory for racism and discrimination and xenophobia.
Right.
And it looks like they're continuing that with Days of Future Past, where I just know from the trailer, Wolverine says, at first the Sentinels were just targeting mutants, and now they're targeting everyone, you know. So that's really playing off that universal theme that seems to seep through all the films. And in the Wolverine solo films, it's about him being an outcast from society. Is he a loner? He always was a loner, and he can always rely on himself, but does that mean he can let people in? Can he have loved ones? But of course, there's always consequences, and his loved ones are often hurt or killed because of that, which is a big theme that we're seeing in the Amazing Spider-Man movies as well. Another major theme is identity. Who is this person now? Now that they have the superpowers, or now that they've maybe killed or made a decision or joined a team, how does that affect their identity? That also results in transformation. So you have this theme of transformation. And then finally, you have the theme of freedom. You know, certainly Captain America is fighting for freedom and justice and the American way, you know, if you will. And that's been a big part of his arc, because Steve Rogers was really established as a man out of time. I think that was a really great choice that they made to make that his main characterization in the two Captain America films. Well, not so much in the first film, because he was in his own time until the end, but definitely this part 2, the Winter Soldier, and in the Avengers, he's a guy who comes from the 40s. It was a different world. It was more simple. It was bad guys versus good guys, and you knew where you stood in the world, and there wasn't a whole lot of gray. It was pretty much black and white. So now he finds himself in 2014, and he, you know, often doesn't know what to do with himself. He has to reorient himself.
And you can say that in a way, his theme is also sort of the same as Wolverine. He's also an outsider. He's a foreigner to our time.
Mm-hmm. And in Winter Soldier, they made it a bit more relevant in that they brought in the Falcon character, and they're basically talking about both being soldiers and PTSD. You know, the Falcon leads this group of veterans. You know, like a encounter group, a discussion group, and so they're grounding it more in our current situation, because PTSD and soldiers committing suicide is such a huge issue now. So it's a nice relevance and decision by the storytellers to make the film relevant to today's world. As far as protagonists, you have a lot of different categories for the hero, for the main hero of the film. You have what I call the chosen one, which is someone like Superman. Kind of, it's in his DNA, his superpowers. He was chosen, and they definitely emphasize this in Man of Steel. In the beginning, his father says, you know, they're going to worship him like a god. He gets to Earth, and then his adopted father basically charges him to be an example, to set an example for Earthlings. The other type would be the kind of accidental or unlikely hero. Um, Daredevil, is blinded by the radioactive waste. The Hulk becomes the Hulk because of the gamma rays. The Ninja Turtles, it's the same thing as Daredevil. They have the radioactive waste, and the Fantastic Four, they're in space and they get the rays. Um, so that's another category. Then you have what you might call the self-made hero, someone like Batman or Iron Man. You're using their genius and their training to become a hero. Um, you could probably put Tony Stark also under the kind of quote science geeks category of hero. You would also put Ant-Man under that category. And then you have the category of hero that doesn't necessarily have superpowers, but they're super skilled. So that would be Hawkeye and Black Widow, you know. So it's important when you're writing these stories to really get down your main dramatic elements, your main characterizations, your central themes that you want to explore, the four main story engines. And if I can mention my own method, which is story maps, and I've written a number of books in the story map series, what it basically is breaking down and outlining the major elements of your story before you begin to write. And what's best there is that instead of pounding out what you might call a vomit draft, just a long, chaotic first draft, and you might spend years honing that and tightening that and rewriting that. Well, why not start with a super strong, cohesive outline or story map, which maps out all the main dramatic elements and the main characters and the antagonists and the themes and the progression of the story in a very clear, concise beat sheet. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go to my website, which is act4screenplays.com. That's ACTFOUR screenplays.com. Or you can look up my story maps books on Amazon or on my website as well, and you can get those. Or if I should I can give a plug now, if that's okay with you, Steve.
Yeah, perfect. Great.
To my upcoming webinar called Writing the Superhero Movie. That's with the Writer's Store. With my webinar and with my clients and my books, I don't want to project some kind of naive belief that an aspiring writer can walk in off the street and be hired to write the next Captain America movie. The big tentpole superhero movies from the major studios, those are written by the top 20 to 30 screenwriters in Hollywood. You're not going to get that assignment. But what you can do is write a new take on the genre. So like what you just said was, if you create a superhero universe within a genre that we haven't seen it in yet, or within a setting, or a set of characters, that we haven't seen it done before, that's going to grab the eye of an agent, a manager, a producer, and that could really be your calling card or strong sample in Hollywood to break in as a screenwriter. So an example of that would be the movie Chronicle. They took the found footage approach to a superhero story, and it was essentially sci-fi, but the style in which they did it and the treatment of it, kind of a more serious, gritty, high school characters type of treatment with found footage style, that was something that we hadn't seen done with the superhero genre yet. So I think that the industry needs new voices to reinterpret the genre. We've all seen the question in the media, how long can these superhero movies last? How long before the audience finally says, you know what, I'm sick of Captain America 8 and Spider-Man 22. I'm just not going to pay my money for these anymore, Probably that will never happen as long as they keep making good movies. But what I think the antidote for that is, and the cure for that is, write a great new superhero movie that nobody's thought of before, or a satire like Kick-Ass. It's kind of an R-rated satire of superhero genre. There was that film, I think, was it Super, the one with Rainn Wilson where he says "Shut up, crime." I think that was the film Super, which was pretty funny. That was just kind of a superhero satire comedy with a dark edge to it, and that's what I think aspiring screenwriters can do, and I think there is room for that, and it can break you in and really get you noticed. So,
Could you maybe name a couple of superhero movies that are actually, other movies in disguise? One example would be to just jump out of the superhero genre is that um, Avatar is actually Pocahontas. If you basically
mhm.
take out the science fiction elements, could you name a few superhero movies that are basically something like maybe Romeo and Juliet, or a different movie that just has the gloss of superhero over it, and people think, oh, it's just a completely different movie.
I would use Hancock as an example of um, putting the story of a drunk, down on his skids loser who needs to turn his life around, which
Okay,
you see in many indie dramas. Um, and they've put that into the superhero world, and they've found an excuse to have big action set pieces.
right.
So I would say that would be an example in that respect.
So Dan, as we've seen in recent movies, superheroes have become darker and darker. To I guess to attune to the current audience in our modern world. Do you think there's a longing to a return to much more optimistic and stoic superheroes of the past? One example would be like Christopher Reeve's Superman.
Yeah, I think so. It seems to be that there is that out there, that audiences might be tiring a little bit. But what has always been a tradition in trilogies is that the second installment of a trilogy is usually always darker. I don't know why exactly that is. Maybe The Empire Strikes Back started that, but we can see that in almost every trilogy, the second installment kind of is more sobering. It's more serious. It's more of a definitely an escalated threat and challenge to the hero. And so we've seen that this year with the Winter Soldier and with the Amazing Spider-Man 2, which I know there's been a lot of criticism about. And we were talking offline about, well, can you have too many villains? Are you just packing too much into one movie? And that's kind of a whole nother discussion, and I'll be going over that in the webinar as well. I'm going to touch on trilogy structure compared to structure of a single film. By the way, so I have that URL. So my webinar is called Writing the Superhero Movie, and it goes live on Thursday, May 15th, 2014, and that's at 1 p.m. Pacific Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time in the US. Now, you don't have to listen live. You can stream it afterwards. It will be archived. And you can sign up at writersstore.com. That's writersstore.com with two S's / writing the superhero movie. So basically, writing the superhero movie with dashes at writersstore.com. And we're going to be talking about building a superhero screenplay from the ground up using these big examples, these tentpole huge hit films like the X-Men films, like the Marvel Cinematic Universe films, but also with a focus on writing your own unique superhero screenplay with the practical knowledge that you're not going to write a huge, you're not going to write the next Spider-Man movie, so we know that. So what are some techniques that you might use to write your own, quote, smaller, more intimate superhero screenplay? I mean, that's something I loved about the Avengers. The Avengers, seeing that first time in 3D, that was like a religious experience for me, because it really was the kid in me seeing these characters come to life. I mean, it was like my dream when I was 12 years old, reading Marvel Comics obsessively. My dream was to see them live in action in photorealistic, battle. Um, and the Avengers was a more positive, more sunny, more primary colors universe. Not that it wasn't serious, but I did appreciate that about it. But we do see that there are a number of dark superhero takes, and the recent one would be Sony's Spider-Man universe. Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a bit darker and edgy. I mean, the whole Amazing Spider-Man 1 also was kind of a more edgy take on the character, but they pushed it a little bit further, and we now know that they have in development a Venom movie and a Sinister Six movie. The Sinister Six was set up very obviously, some might say kind of clunkily, at the end of Amazing Spider-Man 2. But this is an interesting discussion. I mean, how do you have whole movies about essentially villains? Who's going to be the hero then in Sinister Six?
Correct. So, I mean, I guess this goes back to one of the screenwriting rules that if you have a bad guy or a flawed hero, you make someone worse than he is. So I guess they might have to create a villain that's probably more worse and more hateable than whoever the Sinister Six are.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they've said if Spider-Man's going to actually appear in it. Maybe he will. I don't know, but I'm wondering, since they've spent a lot of time on the Harry Osborn character in Amazing Spider-Man 2, maybe it's his is the arc that's going to be he realizes that he's unleashed this terrible evil and he needs to stop them himself, and so his arc is going to be one of making that moral decision. So I don't know, that's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
And Venom, it's funny, I actually remember getting Marvel's Secret Wars issue number 8. I actually bought that from the comic shop, and it had the black Spider-Man's black costume for the first time ever on the cover, and that was the first appearance of that. And it turned out that it was a symbiote, and it was an alien creature, and that's what created the black suit. And then they evolved that into the Venom character, and we saw Venom in Spider-Man 3. Although I don't know, did the fanboy community kind of didn't really like how Venom was characterized in Spider-Man 3, right?
Correct, and I think there's a myriad of other problems too with the way Spider-Man 3 was done as a movie, and that's probably what killed that series, and they wanted to reboot it so soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you were saying you were interested in the idea of, can you have too many villains in a movie? So what do you think? Are there some movies that you think just have tried to cram too much in and just didn't work?
Definitely. I mean, again, using the example of, I feel like it's the Amazing Spider-Man. A lot of the stuff was shoehorned in, especially the Rhino at the end.
Mm-hmm.
From another era, I'd say, and this really dates us. It's the original Batman and Robin from 1997.
Mm-hmm.
And way too many. I mean, they on top of the messed up characterizations, they had Bane, Poison Ivy, and Arnold Schwarzenegger's Mr. Freeze with the one-line puns. And it was just too much, and especially they also had Batgirl in there. But
that's actually my favorite movie of all time. No, I'm kidding.
From a screenwriting perspective, can you tell me what makes or breaks a movie with multiple villains?
Sure. It's all about maintaining the narrative focus of the story. A good example would be The Dark Knight from 2008. I have a book that I co-wrote with William Robert Rich called Story Maps, the Films of Christopher Nolan, and we map out all 3 Dark Knight films. And if you look at what I call the basic story map of The Dark Knight, which is the main dramatic elements focused on the protagonist and their goals and what's standing in the way of their goals, the external goal of Bruce Wayne or Batman is to save Gotham City from destruction. It's not just to stop the Joker. It's to save Gotham City. So every character and every plot line and line of action is in service to that. So when Harvey Dent becomes Two-Face, he's also on that same line of saving Gotham City. Now, Bruce Wayne's internal goal changes. First, it's to be with Rachel, his love interest. He wants to be with Rachel. And then when she dies, it becomes to preserve the hope of Gotham's people. So Gotham's citizens become essentially his love interest. And so both of these lines integrate in the climax when he makes that final decision to take the fall and lie that he was the one who killed Harvey Dent, which is such a great ending. A recent example would be Amazing Spider-Man 2, where that didn't quite work with the Rhino character, played by Paul Giamatti, who's chewing the scenery and has great lines like, "I'm the Rhino!" So in that sense, I think they use the Rhino basically as bookends, as an opening and an ending set piece of action. But that's the thing, is he's only connected to action set pieces. He's not connected to the central core of the story, which is Peter Parker protecting his loved ones from being hurt because of his identity as Superman, as Spider-Man. So it's blatant there that all they're doing is setting up the next film. Talk about a film with a lot of characters. X-Men Days of Future Past is going to come out this summer. It hasn't come out yet. And, I mean, do they pretty much have every character from all of the X-Men films so far, Steve?
I think so. I think they have their old and young counterparts too. So, definitely people from First Class and people from the original X-Men movies.
Mm-hmm. And you had mentioned offline that they get the title and the basic story, or the basic concept, from the comic books, but in that sense, it was Kitty Pryde going back in time, not Logan, correct?
Correct. And it was Kitty Pryde, or AKA Shadowcat, her mind going back in time. This time it's Logan's mind going back in time into his younger body.
Mm-hmm. But his younger body will look exactly the same, I assume, right?
Should be, but we can't do anything about Hugh Jackman's body, but supposedly he's supposed to be a younger Wolverine.
But in The Wolverine, he basically looked the same in the 40s during World War II because he's essentially immortal, right?
Correct. Yes.
So if this is the 60s, I guess, he'll probably look the same.
Yep.
Which is good, then they can save money on casting. So
yeah,
because they're already paying Hugh probably like $25 million to do this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that looks like an incredibly huge, epic movie, and it's going to be a juggling match, though. I mean, from a screenwriting perspective, that is a huge challenge to juggle that many protagonists and antagonists, really. Okay, why don't we wrap this up, Steve? As we said, superhero movies are here to stay, and we didn't even get into Guardians of the Galaxy. We've got that coming in August, so it's going to be a great superhero summer. To remind you, I'm doing a webinar with the Writers Store, and that is Thursday, May 15th. It goes live, and then it's archived after that, and you can find that at writersstore.com/writing-the-superhero-movie. So that's writersstore.com with 2 S's. And you'll find that under webinars, Writing the Superhero Movie. And we're going to be talking about superhero movies from the screenwriting perspective, from the structure and breaking them down, and character arcs, and all of those great storytelling and screenwriting topics. And then I'm going to be talking a bit about writing your own superhero movie. And you can read more from Steve Lam on bamsmackpow.com, which is the best website out there for all comic book superhero related topics. And Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's bamsmackpow.com/author/Steve Lam.
Correct. That's correct,
okay.
Dan.
And that's Lam, L-A-M. And until next time, we will sign off. I'm Dan Calvisi, author of the Story Maps Screenwriting books from act4screenplays.com. And Steve, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much, Dan. I had lots of fun discussing superheroes and where they're going in movies.
Yeah, we'll have to do this again.
Definitely.
Okay, great. All right. Well, take care, everyone. We'll see you next time.